Welcome to Political Ideas and Thoughts, a channel that tries to put a nuanced perspective on any situation, but also, explaining the problems with things and whatnot, but trying not to do it in a super critical or, destructive way. And in this episode, I'm going to explain why I don't like special interest groups or parties and why I don't like them. Because it's not about my personal opinion necessarily, although it is, but it's also more about how they are structured and why special interest groups and parties don't necessarily do what you think they're going to do. And the reason, I'll get into a lot of the reasons why in this episode. I mean, it's not just me saying I don't like them for, because they don't feel right or whatever. It's because they have specific flaws and problems that probably can't necessarily even be addressed because of the fact that they are a party or a special interest group, and so they are institutionalized. So why do I not like special interest groups or parties? Let's start with special interest groups first because they're easier, and it'll be a lot quicker to explain the reason. So think of an example of a nonprofit, and if you like a nonprofit, that's fine. I'm not telling you to like or dislike anything, but if you let's say you have a nonprofit that is focused on, let's make something up, like saving the wattlebees. I just made that up. Okay, so let's say that the wattlebees are endangered, right? And so this nonprofit does all this activity, and gets these wattlebees. This might actually be a real thing, by the way. If it is, whatever, let's just use it anyways. So let's just say that they do all this work to get the wattlebees saved. They get them on the endangered list, and then they do all these things, and whatnot. And that's all fine and good, that's great and everything. But the problem comes in after they are saved, after they are off the endangered list, or after they don't meet the requirements to be on the endangered list anymore, and then they are actually, at least, if not plentiful, they are more common than they were. So what the nonprofit would have to do at that point would have to disband, right? They would have to disband because they don't have anything else to work on anymore. Because their organization would be called Save the Wattlebees or something like this. But the problem is they don't always do this. And they don't always work in this way. And perhaps I chose a bad example because, when it comes to animals, it's always complicated, and there's always a possibility that the problem could resurface. So let's take, and this isn't necessarily something I blame these groups on necessarily. I think it has to do more with what happens when you rigidize a certain idea. So let's take, and this is by no means true, but it does point out a problem that can happen sometimes when you're doing this. So let's take a group like feminism. So feminism's original goal was to get all this stuff for women, and I'm not saying that they're not necessarily they're finished necessarily completely with their goal, but we'll get into that in a second. So they do all this stuff They get it all done, and that's great and that's awesome. But the problem is that because most of the problems that feminism faced are now gone, they haven't actually admitted that they've fixed a lot of these problems. And I'm not saying that it's completely fixed or that it's completely over or anything like that, because there's still problems. But you have some of them saying that the problems are not fixed, and the problems are worse. Even sometimes they'll say, a lot of times they'll say, and all these things. And I'm not saying that they're, doing this deliberately. That they're, they know their time is almost up, so they're doing what they can to keep the group in place. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is what happens when you have a group or an ideology. And you may think that feminism isn't an ideology, but it is, especially nowadays with the way that it's set up. But it's not just feminism. The same could be said for, there's this new group that's been, I guess it's been around for a while, but the same could be said for them. The group, they call themselves the men's rights activists, and they do have some points, but they also have the same kind of problems because of the fact that they are a group, and because of the fact that they are a collective group. And I've talked about this a little bit on my other YouTube channel, but we all have a group that we're in, whatever group that might be. Maybe you're in the nuance group or something like this. There's different types of groups. Some of them better than others. Some of them freer than others when it comes to how you can think and what you can say and whatnot. And so you have this problem with most, I would say probably most groups. Not that the groups are wrong or bad necessarily, but the groups are rigid. The groups don't really have what I'm going to call a freedom of movement as much as like an individual would. And I'm not saying groups are bad. I'm just saying that this is the problem that happens with groups. I've talked about this. I've never really talked necessarily about this, but I've talked about group consciousness in one of my other episodes and on my other YouTube channel about that you pretty much have no choice about what group consciousness you're going to be in, which is actually not necessarily true, but that's another story. So this goes to politics and party. The same thing can be said about this, because you have these groups, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, whatever kind of party it is. I don't really care what the party is. The party could have the greatest nobles in the world, but still have this problem because of the problem of groups and the problem of how parties are. And I don't necessarily blame the parties for this. Some of this goes down to group consciousness. Some of this comes down to how businesses work, how institutions work. Some of this comes down to how minds who are in a group mentality can work, and often they don't necessarily work for the smarter, unfortunately. And so this is why I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of parties or special interest groups, because they don't have the complete and other, they don't have the complete story. And I'm not saying that they're doing this deliberately. I think that the reason why this happens is because of the group itself. It's not because they're doing this purposely, saying, I'm just going to deliberately mislead you. I mean, sure, that can happen sometimes, but I think mostly the reason why it happens that way is because of the way the group consciousness can work. especially when it's mostly collectivist, which most groups are. Most groups are mostly based around these certain goals and these certain ideals, and you really can't go beyond those ideals very often. And if you do, you're not necessarily part of the group, and they don't necessarily call you part of the group. This is why many people are saying that the Democrats are supporting the progressives, and that all these things, that the party's going too far left and all this stuff. But I don't necessarily think that's the case, because the group itself is it is changing, don't get me wrong, but it is also still very much in, I don't want to say the past, but very much in the ways that it was, in some ways, in many ways, even though it is also embodies some of these progressive ideals. But they're also resistant to many of them as well, because of the fact that they are different. And also there's this problem of and I don't necessarily think this is necessarily the case in every single case, but of this problem of pandering, of saying these things to get them to support the Democrats, which actually hasn't really worked in their favor, and actually has been tearing their party apart, because they don't really understand that the progressives themselves are not necessarily in their group as much as they think, or as much as they want them to be. And I don't necessarily know why they want them to be, because most of the country isn't progressive. Most of the country isn't this type of way. And so they're not really thinking this through. And so this is a problem with groups, this is a problem with parties, is that you don't really have a whole lot of choice about, I'm not saying that you can't make your own political decision if you're in a political party, but more often than not, you don't, because you're in this group, you're in this sort of group consciousness, then this collective ego, or whatever you want to call it, and so you don't really have these the decision making power that you would normally. I'm not sure exactly why this happens, but I think most of it has to do with attachment to the group, and loyalty to the group and whatnot. So the more loyal that you are to this group, the more attached you are to this group, the more you're going to go with what they're saying. And the less loyal, the less attached, the less you're going to go with what they're saying. And this is why I don't necessarily join. This is why I'm not registered as any group. This is why I don't necessarily affiliate with any type of group. I make my own group. Because most of these groups are, they don't have the same sort of freedom of thought and movement as other groups. Like I said, this doesn't mean that you don't have independent thinkers in this group, but it's pretty uncommon for some reason. And I think it has to do with how ideology works and how the group consciousness works in the first place.
12:29.
Anyways.
Time recorded. Recording 14:17. Add loaded with.
It's a very short video, but I just wanted to make this to explain why parties and special interest groups aren't necessarily the best things to exist, and are indeed can be problematic. So, hope you like this episode. I hope you get something from this, and I'll talk to you on the next one.